This show is brought to you in part by viewers like you who joined a Patreon or become YouTube members. Thank you. And if you could, hit the like button and subscribe if you want more Browns-focused content.
So watching the Super Bowl, lots of different thoughts about what that means for the Browns' future and what we saw there. Again, I don't want to get too reactionary after the Super Bowl because sometimes people watch the Super Bowl and just because the game itself ended up in a specific way, people make these long, giant assumptions that you would never make based on a full season or just one game, that you would never make on just one game. But one of the things that I think people are going to take away from this Super Bowl victory with the Eagles is just how important a elite defensive line is, because that's going to be the main talking point, right? The Eagles had an elite defensive line and a pretty damn good secondary. That balance was able to put pressure on Pat Mahomes and was basically able to even playing field with a team like the Philadelphia Eagles. And I look at that narrative that's going to be running through the offseason and think to myself, I wonder if this makes it more likely, if you're a team in the AFC especially, to go all in on a trade for Myles Garrett in the way that you might have not been ready to go all in if Pat Mahomes had won the Super Bowl. Because if Pat would have won it, the narrative would have been about Pat's greatness and how important having an elite quarterback is. But now that Pat hasn't won it, people aren't going to act like Jalen Hurts is one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. He's pretty good, but he's not the best quarterback in the NFL or anything like that. It's going to be about other things that are important, like the defense. So one of the things that came into my mind while I was watching the Super Bowl, I had this thought. I was talking to other AFC North Talk guys about this, and the thought was in the back of my mind was like, hey, is the AFC not as good as we think it is? Because one game versus the Philadelphia Eagles and that offensive line looks like Swiss cheese. And 3 games against AFC opponents, and they could do nothing to Pat Mahomes to bother him. So, what's up with all of that, right? What happened in the AFC playoffs? Because Pat Mahomes in this one game versus the Philadelphia Eagles was sacked 6 times. In the last 2 games he played, the AFC Championship and the divisional round, he was sacked 5 times in those 2 games combined. So if you're a team in the AFC and you think you're a legitimate threat to the Kansas City Chiefs, and right now, if we look at the teams in the AFC who feel like they are legitimate threats to Pat Mahomes and the Kansas City Chiefs. Let's pull it up, right? Let's look at it. Buffalo has to feel like they're a legitimate threat. Baltimore has to feel like they're a legitimate threat. Houston has to feel like they're a legitimate threat. And maybe the Chargers feel like they're a legitimate threat. Teams that might be able to project themselves up enough to think that they're legitimate threats, I would think are Miami, maybe New England, but I think they would wait another year or two, and it may be Denver. Those are the 6 teams. My bad. In the AFC, I think can convince themselves that they're a Myles Garrett away from being a Super Bowl contending team that could eliminate the Kansas City Chiefs. The 2 teams that are chief among it, well, the 3 teams really, but the Browns aren't trading him to the Ravens. The 2 teams that are chief among all of these teams, as I would think they would be the most desperate to get a little better, Buffalo and Houston would be those 2 teams. The issue with both of those teams in trading for Myles Garrett is this. I do not believe the Browns think that trading Myles Garrett this offseason would be worth getting a bunch of late first-round picks. I don't think that's where their mindset is. I think the Browns want something better than a late first-round pick. I think it would be one of those trade markets that, let's say if you're Buffalo. If you're Buffalo and you want to trade to get Myles Garrett, I think you would have to make a trade with a lower level team to get their first in a future draft. So you can then be able to send that pick to Myles. But then we're talking about the cost of being able to bring in Myles Garrett becoming astronomical. That's the ultimate issue with trading for Myles Garrett. A contending team is the only team I think is going to be likely to want to do a Godfather type deal. The problem is that any team that's contending, a quarterback away, not going to really be in a position to give you a Godfather offer because their picks are likely going to be in the back end of the first round, which is just not going to be what the Browns are looking for in terms of value. The Browns would much rather trade with a team like Jacksonville or Chicago or New England, teams that don't project to be perennial contenders for the next 3 years if they're going to get future first, than they would want to with like Houston or Buffalo, who will probably win their division for the next 2-3 years. Also, the fact that going forward, no team right now currently owns more than one first-round draft pick, so nobody has extra first to offer, is also something that I think makes a deal for Myles Garrett very difficult to do right now for anybody. Because, again, if you're the Browns, all of the money incentives are in a place to where it makes absolutely zero sense to trade Myles Garrett. Now, I've heard Myles talk about he's willing to do anything it takes contract-wise to get a trade to a contending team. But the reality is there's only so much that Myles can do as far as his contract to be able to force a trade. He can push by a bonus for this year and maybe even negotiate that bonus out, and it makes it a little bit easier for the Browns to trade him. But we're only talking about 10 out of 50 million, right, that the Browns would be saving from a dead cap hit for Myles. But if you look at this from the other perspective, right, that's looking at this from the Cleveland Browns perspective, if you look at this from Buffalo's perspective, I can see how a team gets desperate enough to be able to say, hey, look, our charts and our analysts tell us that this is not appropriate value for an edge player, but look what Philly did. We could be just like them. This is what could get us to the Super Bowl. This is what get us past Pat Mahomes. And the team I have squarely in my sights for all of that is the Buffalo Bills. No team in the NFL is looking at what happened to the Kansas City Chiefs and getting more ideas than the Buffalo Bills, because they are the team that can't get past the Kansas City Chiefs. So anytime somebody beats them, they're going to want to replicate whatever that team that beat them was able to do. And now that team's the Philadelphia Eagles and they were able to beat Pat Mahomes by just attacking that offensive line, that the Kansas City Chiefs can't really do much to improve, right? Like, that's just not really, there's not really a ton they could do there. They got to worry about keeping Trey Smith, right? Like, they're going to lose guys who are going to make that offensive line worse if they leave on top of where it already is. So this is a huge vulnerability for the Kansas City Chiefs going forward. I think Buffalo will get big eyes about that, and I think Houston will get big eyes about that. Now, Buffalo is not in a strong position because I think the Browns would be very hesitant to trade them to Buffalo, given that they're going to have late first-round picks. So if you're Buffalo, you need to acquire somebody else's first-round pick in 2026 or whenever, right, in order to throw that in a trade for Myles Garrett to sweeten the pot for the Cleveland Browns. Do the Buffalo Bills have anything that can net them a first-round pick? I don't know. I don't know if Buffalo has a ton of things that they could sell off right now that would make it easier for them to get a first-round pick, to be honest with you. I don't think they have anything they can really sell off. Now, the Texans could get creative here, right? Because if you're the Texans, you could do something drastic. And what that something drastic might be is say, hey, we're this far away. We need an elite defense now. We're willing to trade Will Anderson to get Myles Garrett in some way, shape, or fashion. Or, say, hey, we're willing to ship off Derek Stingley to somebody in order to help us get an extra first to send to Cleveland. The price for Myles Garrett is not going to be a reasonable price this offseason. The Browns have no reason to have reasonable demands for the price of Myles Garrett. If you want to trade for Myles Garrett and have him on roster in 2025, 2026 season, you're going to have to pay an outrageous price tag because the Browns have no incentive to make this shit reasonable for anybody because it would hurt them more than it would help them in the short term. And who knows if the people in charge, if they make this move this offseason, will even be able to benefit from the long term. Maybe a more reasonable trade for Myles Garrett, which would be the standard 2 first in a pick swap in day 2 or day 3. Maybe that will be able to happen in the 2026 offseason. But if you're trying to trade for him now, you're going to have to pay inflation prices for Myles Garrett, and that rightfully so if you're the Cleveland Browns. So if you're a team, if you're looking at teams that could be willing to pay inflation prices, that's going to be Buffalo, that's going to be Houston. That's going to be teams in the AFC that are looking at the landscape right now and saying, oh my God, this is how we can get past Pat Mahomes. Because that's what it's all about in the AFC. How do you get past Pat Mahomes? If you think that Myles Garrett is the key to getting past Pat Mahomes, you might be willing to offer a crazy package or make crazy moves in order to get that guy. Buffalo is not in the position to make a crazy move. Baltimore, similar to Buffalo, not in the position to make a crazy move. I don't see who Baltimore or Buffalo can move that would net them a first or get them a first in some way, shape, or form that aren't integral or absolutely critical to what they want to do. And also, Baltimore is in the Browns division, so you're talking about attacks on top of attacks, right? Like, you're going to have to play crazy prices of your Baltimore to get Myles Garrett from Cleveland. And Cleveland still might do it because they're not going to trade a dude like that in division. So we're really talking about Houston. Like, can they offer a crazy deal? Or maybe some team in the NFC, can they offer a crazy deal? Because they see this as the piece to get them past Pat. I don't see an NFC team getting as desperate, but I do see an AFC team getting as desperate. And maybe that team is the Houston Texans. And the Houston Texans have young players that people would be willing to sacrifice picks for in order to get, or a young player that you could swap in exchange for Myles that might make the pain of losing a player like that a little bit less for the Cleveland Browns to the point that they're willing to pull the trigger on it. I think for the Texans, having Derek Stingley Jr., having Will Anderson could become bargaining chips that in some way, shape, or form can help them get Myles Garrett. I've heard people bring up the Dallas Cowboys. Maybe Dallas thinks that this is what it's going to take, but I don't think defense has been their problem as of late. But maybe this is what Jerry Jones thinks this could happen, and he's willing to trade Jamaica for Myles, even though I don't think that's an exchange that they would make. But even Dallas has a similar problem where it's like, hey, do you really want Dallas's first for the next 3 years? Like, I don't know if I want their first for the next 3 years because they're probably going to be better than they were this year with a healthy Dak Prescott over the next 3. But it's a more attractive first, most certainly, than like the projections of Buffalo right now, right? Like, that's not a great first round offer. So there's a lot there to think about. But I do think the Super Bowl going down in the fashion that it did will put the battery in the backpack of some GMs to maybe make an aggressive move here for Myles. And if you want to get Myles Garrett this offseason for the Browns, it's going to have to be an ultra aggressive offer. At least I would assume it would have to. If it's not an ultra aggressive offer that gets the Browns to trade Myles, then like Andrew Berry might as well send in his resignation letter with the trade, because you can't just give that dude away. You got to get a haul for that guy in this specific situation. But that's my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Do you think the way that the Super Bowl ended will be a catalyst for a team to make a crazy move for Myles Garrett? Y'all tell me in the comment section down below. Have a great day. Have a better night. Peace.